Like a book, he confirmed, but a good one. Like a battered old paperback, you mean, rather than a glossy magazine. He followed my eyes and my analogy as we looked across to where Kathy was standing with Matt, listening raptly while he extolled something or other about the car. You don't have anything to worry about, Jimmy reassured me, giving my shoulder a friendly squeeze. Matt will be crazy to look at her when he's got you, was all I managed in reply, surprised to feel that the warmth of his words had ignited a small blush. I quickly turned away, catching my reflection in the restaurant's window. I didn't feel my old friend was being entirely honest. If he was, then he seriously should think about getting his eyes tasted. I was certainly never going to elicit the kind of reaction from men that Katy did. Long dark hair, fashionable poker straight, big eyes that hardly functioned at all without their contact lenses, and lips that were a little too wide. A pleasant enough face, but not stunning, and I was honest enough to know I was never going to stop traffic, and that had never worried me before. But since being with Matt, who was, let's face it, undeniably gorgeous, I seemed more aware than ever of some of my shortcomings. And just remember, to me, you will always be the freckly faced girl with the gap in her front teeth, whose ears stuck out. I was 10 years old then, I protested. Thank God for orthodontia. Do you really have to remember every damn thing about my geeky childhood? I can't help myself, Jimmy replied. I would have pursued that strange comment if we hadn't just then been joined by the others. Come on then, urged Matt, grabbing my hand and holding it tightly. Let's go before they give our table to someone else. I walked en masse through the large double doors, arms linked, or thrown casually around a neck-wearing shoulder, never realizing that in the next half hour our lives would be changed irrevocably. We were led directly to a table, situated at the very front of the restaurant, beside a large plate-glass window, where we had an excellent view of the high street and the church perched high up on the hill. As we moved between the tables to reach our seats, I could see Kathy drawing several appreciative glances from the male diners. Matt too hadn't gone unnoticed, but in his case by the women. I tried to stifle that small worried voice that had been whispering in my ear for several months. Matt was a very attractive guy. He naturally drew the attention of other women. It was only to be expected, and while part of me relished the fact that it was my side of me he was standing by, my hand that he held in his as we slalomed between the closely packed tables, there was an unspoken worry that sooner or later I would have to address what would happen when he was faced with temptation when we were apart. Would we be one of the couples who survived the university separation, or would we become victims of the curse of the long distance relationship? This line of thinking was interrupted by the softly accented Italian waiter, indicating we had arrived at our reserved table. Tight for space in the crowded restaurants, they had pushed two tables together to accommodate our party, resulting in a rather narrow gap by a concrete pillar. Someone would have to squeeze past it to reach the seat beside the window. Wishing Sarah had got there first, she was much smaller than me. I nevertheless managed to maneuver through the gap without getting stuck. Matt slid into the chair beside me as the others found their places and sat down. Jimmy took the window seat directly opposite me, with Sarah claiming the chair on his right hand side. I refused to look at the undignified scribble of who was sitting by Kathy on the other side of Matt. I guessed pole position was opposite her anyway, with its excellent view down the front of her top. Under cover of the tablecloth, I tugged down on the hem of my own t-shirt, lowering the neckline by an inch or two. Then felt myself blushing like an idiot when Jimmy noticed. "What's so funny, Jimmy?" Matt asked, and suddenly, by some horrible coincidence, the whole table fell silent to hear his response. I knew my eyes were frantically telegraphing him not to say anything, but I needn't have worried. Jimmy calmly picked up the menu and gave a casual shrug. "Nothing, just thinking of something my uncle said earlier. That's all." While everyone else followed Jimmy's lead and began to study their menus, I looked across and mouthed a silent "thank you." The smile he gave me back was so full of warm affection and friendship that, for some strange reason, my stomach flipped erratically. Confused, I broke eye contact and pretended to be deeply interested in the merits of the lasagna versus the cannoli. Matt's arm snaked around my waist, pulling me against him as we chose our meal. When I did look over to Jimmy a few minutes later, he was deep in conversation with Sarah, and although he caught my glance and gave me a small smile, my stomach remained exactly where it should have been. It was impossible to ignore the nostalgia the nostalgia around the table, and the air of impending separation was almost as apparent as the aroma of tomato and garlic wafting around us. Well, there were still a few weeks before I left for my flat. Brighton, Trevor, and Phil were both going to leave after the weekend, and Sarah only a few days later. Somehow, I couldn't really imagine the remains of our group: Kathy, Jamie, Matt, and myself, all getting together in the remaining weeks. This sudden reluctance to leave struck me unexpectedly with its intensity. It wasn't as though I didn't want to go away to university. Of course I did. I'd certainly worked hard enough to achieve the grades I needed to get on my journalism course. It was just that tonight it was hitting home for the first time that this was really the end of a very important chapter in my life. Just for the moment, I couldn't focus on the new beginnings because all I could think of was leaving behind my boyfriend and my two closest friends. Ridiculously, I felt my eyes begin to water, and I hastily looked away, preferring the dazzling glare of the rays of the dwindling sun to direction from those around the table. If they knew I'd been crying. "You okay?" asked Jimmy softly, leaning forward, so only I could hear his words. Matt was placing the drinks order, so it was safe to reply, "Oh, just feeling a little emotional, I guess. Changes coming, saying goodbye to everyone, stuff like that." I trailed off, expecting some sort of ridicule, but instead was surprised when his hand reached across the table and encircled my fingers, which were fiddling restlessly with the cutlery. His grip felt oddly different, not the familiar clasp I had known since nursery school. Perhaps it was just the rough texture of the skin from his summer gardening, or was it more in the way my hand felt so small, so tightly encompassed in his own? I felt rather than saw Matt's slow awareness of Jimmy's gesture, but rather than a hurried retreat, Jimmy gave my hand one last squeeze took his time before withdrawing his own. In an instinctive response, Matt drew his body closer towards mine, reclaiming both my attention and his territory, and it was only after a moment or two that I became aware that when taking back his hand, Jimmy had managed to transfer the lucky penny he had picked outside the restaurant from his hand to mine. I held the coin tightly in my palm, imbuing the small copper disc with more significance than it deserved. It was typical of Jimmy to offer to share even the possibility of good fortune with me. We had, after all, shared so much for so many years. He was more like my brother than my friend. In fact, when I thought about it, his whole family were closer to me than many of my own relatives. Jimmy's mother and mine had been very good friends long before Jimmy and I were even born. And when my mom had died suddenly when I was just a toddler, Jimmy's family had reached out and drawn both Dad and me into their lives and their hearts. I realized with a shock that my dad wasn't the only family I'd be leaving behind. When I went away, it was going to be almost as tough saying goodbye to Jimmy's parents and his younger brother. When the two bottles of wine Matt had ordered were delivered to the table, everyone took a glass to raise a toast to going away, to not dropping out, to our new lives and old friends. The last was echoed by each person around the table as glasses clinked together, catching a brilliant prism of evening sunlight. As the others sat joking and bantering light-heartedly, I took a second to look around the table, trying to take a mental snapshot of the moment. I knew we were all destined to make new friends at our various colleges and universities, but just now it was hard to believe that the new bonds we would forge could ever be as strong as those that traded between the seven of us around the table. As my eye fell on each friend, a memory or emotion erupted in response. So many, it was almost impossible to separate them, but each recollection was another brick in the wall of our friendship, which I had to believe would remain solid no matter where we would all end up. When I looked at Sarah, I couldn't help but repress a smile. In a strange way, I already felt jealous of the new friends she would be making on her art course. Sarah was crazy, loyal, funny, and incredibly um, caring, and her friendship was one of my most treasured possessions. Whoever they were, these new friends didn't know how lucky they were. And then there was Jimmy. I'd, I'd spent so much of the summer stressing over how it would feel to be apart from Matt that whenever the thought of also saying goodbye to Jimmy had intruded, I'd hastily stuffed it away to the back of my mind. I knew it was strange, but the thought of not seeing my old friend on a regular basis was just so momentous, so hard to absorb that I couldn't even allow myself the time to contemplate it. I realized with some disappointment that I wasn't nearly as ready as I should be to let go of any of them. As we waited for our meals to arrive, I glanced occasionally through the window beside me and up the road to the church. The sun was just beginning its leisurely descent, and the sky was bathed in diluted shades of red and gold, turning the usually drab high street into a magical abstract of colors. There were few pedestrians, but the lines of parked cars flanking both sides of the road meant that the pubs and restaurants were all doing good business that evening. From somewhere in the distance, the distinctive wail of a siren could be heard. Roger, are you listening? I drew my attention away from the scene outside and realized that Jimmy had been speaking. Sorry, I was miles away. What were you saying? His eyes flickered for a second toward Matt, who was chatting to Kathy at that moment on his other side. Jimmy didn't look comfortable having to repeat whatever it was I had just missed. I was asking if you weren't too busy tomorrow afternoon, if you'd be able to come around to my house. The oddly hesitant request wasn't like him at all, and I found myself confused both by his tone and by the formality of the invitation. Jimmy and I usually just pitched up at each other's front doors without asking, no invites necessary. Sure, I can do that. I was tending to come around to see your mom and dad again before I left anyway. Actually, they won't be home tomorrow. Again, that odd, uncertain tone. No one will. Just me. I just wanted to have a quiet word with you. Is that okay? Was it the red glow from the sun, or was he actually blushing? He seemed anxious for an answer, so I quickly reassured him, yes, that's fine. I'll see you around 2 o'clock. He nodded, then sighed, as though some dreaded task had been accomplished which only served to heighten my curiosity. I guess I would have to wait until the next day to find out what was on his mind. The waiters arrived with the laden plates and began to set them in front of us. Straightening up in his seat, Matt removed his right arm from where it had been resting around my waist, pausing to plant a firm kiss unexpectedly on my lips. Please, people are trying to eat around here, groaned Sarah. I grinned back at Matt and held my fist very still while he tucked a wayward strand of hair behind my ear. It was an insignificant gesture, but later I would wonder what might have happened to us all if he hadn't been leaning so close and seen the car. What the hell? He cried. I spun around to follow his gaze, my mouth dropping in amazement as I saw a small red car with all four wheels off the tarmac catapult into view over the crest of the hill. Moments later, a second car appeared, driving almost as fast and only slightly less recklessly, its flashing blue lights and discordant sirens shattering the peace of the summer evening. And horror, I saw a small van emerge from a side street, its driver having to stand on his brakes to avoid losing the best part of its front end as the red car halted past. The red car grazed the sides of several parked vehicles, showering the pursuing police car in a cloud of red-hot sparks. The shrieking scream of rubber from the braking van alerted the rest of the group to the oncoming danger, but Matt was way ahead of us and shot to his feet. He's lost it. He's out of control. That car's going to crash. Get away from the window. Now. I felt Matt's tight grip on my shoulder as he got to his feet, screaming out his warning. The panic became infectious as people around us also began to shout distractedly. I noticed the waiter dropping two of our plates of food on the floor before retreating hastily away from our table. Well, that's made a horrible mess, I found myself thinking stupidly. It wasn't as though I couldn't see what was happening or that I hadn't fully understood my boyfriend's cry of warning. It was just that everything had suddenly and strangely slipped into slow motion. There seemed to be no immediate rush. There was plenty of time to get away from the table, no need to have dropped two perfectly good dinners in the process. Around me was a blur of movement. I saw Jimmy and Sarah get out of their seats and run over to where Phil was standing, screaming for the rest of us to move. Matt's hand remained pressed in the hollow of my shoulder as I felt him half drag me from my chair. With his other hand, he propelled Kathy, who was standing beside him, away from the table. The chaotic scramble of flung-back chairs and knocked over wine glasses could only have taken a second or two, but in that time I did something real dumb. I turned to look back through the window at the approaching car. It straddled the center line of the road, heading straight toward the bend and the front of the restaurant with no sign of slowing down. That was the moment that Matt lost his grip on my shoulder. Horrified, I turned back from the window and saw that he and Katy were already some distance away. I stumbled forward to follow them, but Matt's chair had been knocked over and was now wedged firmly against the pillar beside me. My exit was blocked. I pushed at the fallen chair frantically, succeeding only in wedging it further between the edge of the table and the pillar. "Rachel!" screamed Sarah at the top of her lungs. "Get out of the way!" I pushed and kicked at the chair with every ounce of strength I had, fear and adrenaline coursing through me, until the sounds of the restaurant diminished and all I could hear was the roar of the blood in my ears. In desperation, I looked up to Matt, who began to move toward me until unbelievably, Kathy grabbed his arm and held him back. "No, Matt, no, there's no time, you'll be killed." I heard that, all right, and part of my brain, the part that wasn't focused on trying to not let the rest of me get killed, absorbed what Kitty had just done. If she thought I was going to let that pass, she was very much mistaken. But then another noise rose from the street behind me, the screech of brakes. I glanced behind me one last time and saw the car was braking. But much too late, the speeding vehicle grew increasingly larger in the window, so close now that I could make out the terrified face of its young driver, his eyes wide in terror as the inevitable approached. I never saw him coming. He must have moved at incredible speed to get to me. One moment I was trapped in the tiny space I never saw him coming. He must have moved at incredible speed to get to me. One moment I was trapped in the tiny space between the fallen chair and the window, and the next two strong arms appeared from across the table and fastened onto my own like a vice. How he found the strength I never knew, but Jimmy literally hauled me from my trapped position over the top of the table. I caught the look on his face as he dragged me across the surface, mindless of the scattering bottles and glasses as I plowed through them. His eyes were filled with indescribable fear, and the tendons of his neck stood out like cables with the effort he was using to pull me toward him. I grabbed onto him, trying to help, my feet scrabbling frantically over the clothes to propel me forward. From behind us, I heard a loud thump as the car left the road and mounted the pavement. Jimmy threw me. That's the only way to describe what he did. One minute I was half across the table, and the next I was lifted up and thrown like a rag doll, slithering down to the floor some feet away. But that act of impossible strength and bravery had taken up the last precious milliseconds between the car leaving the road and crashing into the restaurant. Jimmy was still standing directly in the path of danger when the window exploded behind him. The first thing I felt was the heat. Something heavy pinned my legs, trapping them under a weight of pain that burned like fire, and there seemed to be water everywhere, thick, salty water running freely down from my forehead, over my cheeks, into my eyes and mouth. I tried to cry out, but no sound came. There was nothing left in my lungs but smoke-filled vapor. Someone was screaming behind me. Someone else was crying. I tried to turn my head, but I couldn't see properly, with the sticky wetness blocking my vision. Tentatively, I raised one hand to my head and attempted to rub my eyes. My hand came away covered in a slick red gauntlet of blood. All around me was a mountain of debris, so thick and dense I couldn't see beyond it to where the crying and screaming people were. The car, half in, half out of the shattered window, was also blocking my view. It was impossible to see what was left of the mangled vehicle, as the air was thick with a dense fog of smoke from the engine and disintegrated masonry from the front wall. I felt the shroud of glass over and under me and knew I must be lying among the remains of the window. From behind me, from behind me, I heard voices shouting frantically as masonry and rubble shattered and shifted, and I realized that people were trying to reach us. Us. Not just me, of course, not just me. Jimmy had been there when the car came through the window. Jimmy, who had left his position of safety and had come back to save me, ignoring the way the blood flowed even faster. When I turned my head, managed to lift my neck an inch or two off the glass to look for him, the haze of dust and smoke was still too thick, but I thought I could make out a ship some feet away to one side, broken masonry blocks and a long twisted piece of metal were lying at a strangely skewed angle on top of a long whiteboard. As my vision began to clear, I realized that it wasn't a board at all. It was what was left of our table. And the reason why it wasn't lying flat against the floor but was canted at that strange angle was that something or someone was beneath it. Mindless of anything else, I flung out my arm, raking it in a desperate arc toward the crushed table and what I knew must be beneath it. At first I felt nothing, and then the very tips of my fingers brushed just for a moment against something soft. Jimmy, I croaked hoarsely. Jimmy, is that you? Can you hear me? No reply. Jimmy, I started to cry, the tears cutting small rivulets through the dirt and blood on my face. Jimmy! Oh no, Jimmy, say something. The dust and debris had begun to settle a little, and I could make out what it was. I had been able to reach. Jimmy's forearm protruded at a strange angle from beneath what was left at the table. That was all I could see of him, just his forearm. The arm still looked strong and tanned as it had a few moments before, when it had somehow found the strength to pull me away from danger. Only now it wasn't moving. Long before the ambulance reached us, I realized that it would never be moving again. December 2013. 5 years later. The wedding invitation was propped up on the mantelpiece, almost hidden by a small bundle of bills and fast food delivery circulars. I suppose I was trying to bury it. Perhaps I thought that by not seeing it, I could claim to have accidentally forgotten about it and somehow missed the date. As if that was ever going to happen. Of course, I replied with an acceptance card when the invitation had arrived a few months earlier, but that had been easy when the thought of going back to Great Beef Bishopsford had seemed so far ahead in the future that I didn't need to really think about it. But now, with the date only 2 days away, as I stood in my tiny flat with an open overnight suitcase before me, I didn't know why I'd ever felt that I would be strong enough to do this, to go back. Abandoning my packing for a moment, I retrieved the small embossed card from the mantelpiece. Mr. and Mrs. Sam Johnson request the pleasure of your company at the marriage of their daughter Sarah to David. I ran my finger lightly over the wrist scroll names, and I knew then, as I had always known, that I had to go, that I couldn't make some pathetic excuse and not be at the wedding of my best friend just because it was taking place in my old hometown. And was it really the town I was scared of, or the memories that I knew were waiting for me there? Memories I'd schooled myself to bury deep and never allowed to surface. Still clutching the thick cream-colored invitation, I raised my head to look at my reflection in the mirror above the mantelpiece. In my eyes, I saw the truth. Returning to the town was only half the problem. My greatest fear was how I would cope with seeing everyone all together in one place again for the first time in years. While almost everyone, a haunted look fell over my face that seemed appropriate, for I knew it wasn't a reunion with the living that was going to be so hard to deal with. I packed my bag mindlessly, not really concerned about what I took. The trip was only for 3 days, and then I'd be back in my own flat, able to lose myself once again in the anonymity of a big city. Too many, I'm sure. It might sound peculiar, but I'd actually come to relish living where everybody didn't know your name. The items I took more care in packing were my outfit for the hen night dinner and the deep burgundy velvet dress I had bought to wear for the wedding itself. Thank God Sarah had eventually given in and accepted my refusal to be her bridesmaid. But you have to, she had pleaded, and for a second it could have been the old school days, Sarah imploring me to join her in some crackpot scheme or caper she had cooked up. Only this time I had held fast in my refusal. I'd felt bad, of course, but then I didn't know what she was going to ask me even before the words had left her lips. It wasn't often that she visited me in London, even though we kept in touch every few weeks by phone. Her job in the north kept her busy, and of course, boyfriend, Dave, fiance, I mentally corrected, lived there too, and quite rightly occupied most of her free time. I'd suspected what was coming when she had invited herself down for the weekend, saying no hadn't been as difficult as I'd imagined when I had sufficient time to rehearse. Oh, Rachel, please think again, she had implored, and she'd sounded so crestfallen that I had actually felt myself wavering. There's no one else in the world I want as a bridesmaid except you. Please say you'll do it. And when I'd shaken my head, not quite trusting myself to speak in case she heard the chin of doubt in my resolve, she had inadvertently asked the one question that allowed me to abdicate from the role. But why won't you say yes? And it was then that I seconded the coward's way out, answering her question by lifting away from my face the heavy swath of hair I wore inside parting to reveal the silver forked lightning scar that ran from my forehead to my cheek. She pursued her lips and sighed, and in that moment I knew she had conceded defeat. Ah, so she's pulling the old disfigured face card again, is she? I smiled in response. Everyone else I knew pussyfooted around the issue, but Sarah was the only one who had courage never to dress up her words in anything less transparent than the truth. Well, if that's what it takes to keep me firmly seated in a back pew and not wearing some frothy pink creation up near the altar, then yes. She looked at me mulishly for a second, and I thought she was regrouping for another try, but then she appeared to reconsider and back down, only murmuring in her defeat, I wouldn't have made you wear pink, you know. I'd hug her then. I'd hug her then, knowing I'd let her down in a big way and loving her because she had let me do it. Before closing the case, I picked up the small brown bottle of pills on the bedside table to add them to my toiletry bag. I frowned when I felt the weight of the container holding the bottle up to try and count the contents by the weak light filtering through the window from the overcast December day. There were there were fewer there than I thought, barely enough to last for the next few days. That couldn't be right, could it? I checked the date on the front of the prescription label. 10 days old. The headaches had been getting worse, but hadn't realized I'd gone through that many painkillers so quickly. A cold tremor meandered down my spine. This wasn't good, and while I could lie to my dad when he asked how I was, and even stupidly had tried lying to the doctors, even when the headaches had first started, I knew that soon I'd have to face up to the truth. This was the warning sign they had told us to be on the alert for just years ago. This was the reason why every phone call from my dad in the 3 years we lived apart would follow the habitual patterns of "How are you? No headaches or something?" I'd been happy to report for the first 2.5 years that I'd been fine, but for the last 6 months I'd been lying and saying I was still fine. Eventually, I'd made an appointment to see the specialist I hadn't had to visit since my early days of recovery from the accidents. He seemed concerned when I had told him about the headaches and their frequency, which made me concerned because I'd actually played down their severity considerably. The pills he'd prescribed were not the answer, and he had urged me to make an appointment to go back to the hospital for further tests. I'd taken the prescription but not his advice, and had put off making the appointment I knew that I could no longer avoid. All of this I had kept from my dad. He had enough to worry about with his own health problems. He needed this time to try and get well without concerning himself over me all over again. He'd done far too much of that already. However bleak the outcome of his consultation with his oncologist were, he always would end our calls by saying, "But at least you are all right now, thank God." I didn't have the courage to take that away from him. I'd sometimes wonder exactly how many mirrors we must have broken, or how many gypsies must have cursed us to account for my family's unfortunate history. First mom, then my accident, then dad's illness, and now these headaches. Was there some family out there who had been blessed with 20 odd years of good health and luck? Because we seemed to have been given their share of misfortune as well as our own, and it didn't matter that dad said that no one was to blame for his illness, because I knew what he'd only begun smoking again after my accidents. It had been his way of coping with the stress, and if he hadn't been doing that, then he probably wouldn't be ill now. So many terrible things were linked to that one awful night. A blinding twist of pain, worse than my most severe headaches, stopped my thoughts from venturing down that forbidden avenue. I intended to leave first thing in the morning, and had looked up the times for the first train from London. I'd booked 2 days off work, for although everyone wasn't meeting up until the Thursday evening for Sarah's hen night dinner, I hadn't wanted to arrive late in the day. In reality, I knew I would need the time to compose myself for the 3-day visit, and I had no way of knowing just how hard that was going to be until I was actually there. I refused Sarah's offer to stay at her parents' place. Much as I loved her family, they had always been more exuberant and excitable than my own, and I didn't think I'd be strong enough to face that particular brand of crazy in the run up to the wedding. Dad seemed to understand, and hadn't appeared offended when I declined the offer, and had instead booked a room in one of the town's 2 hotels. Many of the guests would be doing the same, I imagined, although of course quite a large number probably still lived in the area. As the train slipped out of the station for the 2-hour journey, I allowed myself to think of the people I would be meeting again that night, my friends from the past. The bonds I had thought would bind us forever had not proved as resilient as I had always believed, and it hadn't been the passing years that had severed the threads. No, they had been sheared away by a young man's reckless driving and out of control stolen vehicle. Sarah had been extremely careful when filling me in on news of our old group of friends from visits to her parents, and through the town grapevine. She knew that after uni, Trev had returned to Great Bishopford and was currently living with his girlfriend, whom Sarah had yet to meet, and was working as a branch manager in a bank. I found it hard to imagine the rock band guitar playing the thrift of my teenage years in such a sedated and respectable lifestyle. Phil was apparently still living the life of a nomad. He had taken a gap year after university, which had grown into a second year of climbing around the world. The train's rhythm began to slow, and I realized that the 2 hour journey had passed much more speedily than I would have liked. When the androgynous voice of the loudspeaker announced, "The next stop is Great Bishopford," I was alarmed to discover I was no more ready to face my return than I had been any time in the last 5 years. As the train shuddered to a halt, I got to my feet and reached up to retrieve my small overnight bag from the rack. "Allow me," a man's voice offered from behind me, and before I could decline, strong leather-clad arms reached up and lifted down the small case. As I looked up to thank the stranger, I saw the quickly disguised look of sympathy on his face as he took in the jagged scar that became visible as I raised my head. I smiled briefly in thanks and lowered my head, allowing the thick curtain of hair to cover the worst of my marked face. It was a habit I had developed over time. It was easier to hide the scar than to have to deal with people's reaction to it. Those who weren't shocked into silence might be tempted to ask about its origins. And I had made a decision many years ago never to speak of it, and perhaps that was what was scaring me so badly about being back home, because how would the old group of friends get through this weekend without speaking of something so cataclysmic that it had in some way altered each of our lives? I caught a taxi from the station, even though it was only a short walk to the hotel. The walk would have taken me past our old school, and I wasn't prepared yet for the memory stacking that road might elicit. Inside the leather-seated interior of the cab, I kept my gaze firmly fixed on my knees and tried to avoid the inevitable for a little while longer. The hotel room was clean and impersonal. It took all of 3 minutes to unpack my small bag. I glanced at the bedside radio alarm clock. It was nearly lunchtime, and I toyed with the idea of going down to the hotel bar for a sandwich, but at the last moment I lost my nerve and phoned down the room service. "Baby steps," I told myself encouragingly. "Just take little baby steps, and you'll be fine." My reflection looked back at me doubtfully from the dressing table mirror. If I couldn't even convince myself, how on earth was I going to get through the next 72 hours? After I'd eaten, I called Sarah on my mobile to let her know I had arrived. I heard the relief in her voice and was dismayed that she had not been certain I was going to come. This strengthened my resolve to be strong, if only for her sake. "Come over now. I don't want to wait till tonight to see you." Her enthusiasm made me smile better than Sarah always had. I just hoped Dave realized how lucky he was getting to spend his future with such a special person. "Maybe in a little while," I promised, "and you have me at your disposal all day tomorrow, so we'll get plenty of time to talk before you become an old married lady." She groaned at my words and uttered a very unladylike phrase in response. "Actually," I continued, "I think I'll take a little walk this afternoon, see if I can face up to some of these old memories after all. Fancy some company?" I smiled at her offer. She must have 1,001 things to do, yet I knew she'd abandon all of them in a heartbeat if I said yes. "No, that's okay," I replied. "I think I might do this better on my own, and anyway, I'm getting a bit of a headache." I brought my hand up to rub distractedly between my brows as I realized this last was true, so the fresh air would do me good. "Well, don't walk so far that you'll be too exhausted for my hand dinner tonight." As if I'd be allowed to miss that. "Are you doing the bride-to-be tiara costume bit?" "No," came the swift response in mock indignation. "I told you before, this is no tacky girly shindig." This is a mixed grown-up and sophisticated dinner with all of my oldest friends to celebrate my departure from spinsterhood. By the way, you have arranged a trip for me, haven't you? Absolutely, I replied, and was still smiling when I hung up the phone. The air outside was much colder than I had expected, and I was glad of my thick woolen coat and knitted scarf wound tightly about my neck. Without any conscious thought or instruction, my feet found their own rhythm and began to direct me down the twisting side roads that led me to my old home. I didn't intervene. This was the first stop I needed to make, and this should be the easy one. No dark memories there, only happy ones from my childhood. Someone had upgraded the old picket fence with something much fancier made out of wrought iron, and the front door was now a garish green color, but apart from that, it all looked the same. There was a comfort in seeing that the house hadn't been altered too dramatically. Although the garden was better kept, I noticed, but then that had never been much of a gardener. Also, fancy wooden blinds replaced the more homely curtains that we had preferred, but basically it still looked like home. As I lingered on the pavement, I allowed a wave of memories to assault me, a kaleidoscope of images spanning the years. Yet still, there were no dark shadows here. Up until 5 years ago, this was the only home I had known, and it still represented the feelings of safety and sanctuary that had eluded me anywhere else. Standing on the pavement, feeling like I still belonged there, yet at the same time knowing that I did not, I felt a dart of nostalgia pierce me. I realized with shock that this was the first time I had actually seen the house since the night of the accident. The decision to move away and the packing up and sale had all been carried out using during the long slow months of my hospital stay. Whether it was the right decision or not, who could say? My poor father had been desperate enough to do whatever he could to minimize my pain, half demented griefs, and I had clung to him desperately from my hospital bed and pleaded with him to let us move far away. So move we did. Suddenly my memories were cyanide bitter, and I turned from the house and began walking briskly away. My eyes started to water fiercely as a bitter icy wind blasted my face. I looked head down against the gusting currents, and my stride just shot off around. At the end of the street I stopped and hesitated. I was standing at a crossroad. If it hadn't been so heartbreakingly sad, and it would almost have been funny, although the painkillers had stilled my headache to a persistent throb. I could use it as an excuse not to make my next stop, but I thought I'd been hiding behind excuses for too long now. Unlike my old home, Jimmy's house looked completely unchanged and exactly as I'd remembered it. It was almost as though they had preserved it as a monument to him. My hand gripped tightly on the door knocker as a fleeting glimmer of hope ran through me. Perhaps they too had moved. Sarah had never said, but then we hadn't spoken of his family at all in the intervening years. Some wounds just went too deep. If Janet was shocked by my appearance on her doorstep after a 5 year absence, she hid it well. She also hid her reaction to my damaged face, which I knew she must have noticed with the wind whipping my hair above my head in long chestnut banners. I hope I was as good as at masking my own shock when I saw how much she had aged in the intervening years, although she smiled and reached out to envelop me in a welcoming hug. The grief was so deeply etched into her face that I realized no new emotion was ever going to be powerful enough to erase it. Guilt sliced through me like a knife wound. It was my fault she looked like that. My fault she had lost her son. Come in, Rachel, she said softly. It's been a long time. It hadn't been an easy afternoon, and by the time I got back to the hotel, the tension and the emotions of the day had brought me headache to a crescendo of agony. My first action on returning to my room was to blindly fumble in my toiletry bag for the bottle of pills. I ignored the dosage instructions on the label and immediately swallowed two tablets instead of one. As I waited for the medication to kick in, I ran a deep hot bath in the small white tiled bathroom. The headache was still with me as I slid under the fragrantly perfumed water, slightly better when I emerged pink and beginning to shrivel half an hour later, and back to a dull but manageable ache when I realized it was all the time to get ready for the evening. I tried to keep my mind away from my visit with Jimmy's mother, though there was much I needed to consider about what she had said that day. I couldn't afford the luxury of thinking of that now. First, we all had to face the night ahead, a night of reunion, and a time of celebration, all the while trying to ignore the fact that for the first time we'll be meeting at 6 instead of 7. Baby steps, I murmured again to myself as I settled before the dressing table and began to apply my makeup. Sarah had chosen the location for the dinner well. We were booked at a fancy restaurant on the other side of a town, a place far too expensive and sophisticated for us to have frequented in our student days. I arrived early, a good 30 minutes before our reservation, hoping it would give me some sort of mental advantage, having given Sarah's name to the I declined the suggestion and to wait at the bar and asked instead to be seated at our table. I was ushered to a large circular table in the far corner of the restaurant. I chose a chair facing the doorway, wanting the advantage of being able to see who would arrive next. I could certainly have done without the large mirrored wall directly opposite our table. I'd already spent far too much stressing over my reflection in the hotel room. I didn't need the indulgence of another half hour of wondering whether my voice of midnight blue dress with the deep V neckline had been the right one. Having brought no alternative for the evening, there wasn't really much I could do about it either way. Nervously, I kept checking my reflection each time, pulling my hair forward, making sure it swung deeply across my cheek. Phil was the first to arrive, looking tanned and much more muscled and broad-shouldered than I remembered. He crushed me to him in such a bad hug of an embrace. I felt sure some ribs were going to give way in the process. Okay, need to breathe now. He laughed and released me, sliding into the chair beside me. You're looking good, Rachel. He began, and I had to almost sit on my hand to stop myself from automatically reaching up to check if my hair was still hiding my face. If he noticed, he was too polite to say, "It's been way too long." How have you been? Are you still living in Devon? We filled in the gaps in our histories, keeping it light, and his story was sufficiently varied to carry the conversation until the next arrival. Trevor and his partner Kate. I didn't know that Sarah had invited partners. But as I introduced myself after receiving a lift you off your feet hug from her boyfriend, I realized that Sarah had been wise to have included outsiders at our group's reunion. New faces will take the pressure off. For the first time, I counted up the place settings at the table and wondered who the extra seat was for. I didn't have to wait long to find out, for Sarah burst into the restaurant with an infectious grin, a bundle of getting married helium balloons in her hand, and her fiancé Dave in tow. Who brings their fiancé to their hen night? Joked Phil, standing up to shake Dave's hand warmly in greeting. What can I say? He just can't bear to be apart from me. I gave her my warmest smile and then nodded my head toward the balloons. Classy, I thought so. Well, this is a real nice place, pronounced Dave, pulling out a chair for Sarah, before settling himself closely beside her. Very posh. Oh, huh? she confirmed and then stage whispered across to me, better get on the phone and cancel the entertainment. Wretch. By this time, Trevor had been approached by the wine white waiter, and while a discussion ensued over what to order, Sarah took the opportunity to lean over and whisper in my ear, "How are you doing, Han? Really? Hanging in there?" I whispered back, and when I saw the constant cloud her brow, I knew I had to try harder. "I'm fine, stop worrying about me." She gave my hand a quick squeeze and leaned back in her chair. The first awkward moment occurred shortly after our chosen drinks were delivered to our table. "So who are we missing then?" asked Trevor blithely, and an uncomfortable silence ricocheted between us. Matt and Kathy said they might be a little late, Sarah said quickly, and Dave, who clearly was in tune with his future wife, immediately forestalled any awkwardness by embarking on a long and improbable story about his recent experience with a parking attendant. We were all still laughing when I noticed a few diners at our tables glancing up in appreciation toward the entrance. Without looking up, I knew they had arrived. Individually, they had always had the ability to turn heads. I knew that only too well from my own time spent by Matt's side, but together they were phenomenal. Magazine photo perfect, movie star beautiful. The combination was almost breathtaking, and as they made their way toward us, I noted that they both looked, if anything, even more stunning than they had 5 years earlier. I'd never felt so plain in my entire life, and empty, because I knew that in another life with another roll of the dice, there would have been someone sitting at this table to reassure me that was simply not so. Kathy had dressed to stun. That much was obvious. The figure hugging black halter-neck dress did exactly what it was supposed to do. The neckline and thigh-high split gave tantalizing glimpse of both cleavage and long tan legs. Her hair was blonder than I remembered and fluffed to perfection about her face, but it was Matt who drew my eye, who had always drawn my eye, I admitted honestly. Like Phil, he too looked taller and broader than I remembered. His dark suit and crisp white shirt looked expensive, and from their immaculate fit, I guessed they hadn't been bought off the peg. His face was leaner, more chiseled than it had been, although his eyes, as they met mine and smiled in greeting, were still the same. I tried to smile convincingly back, thinking suddenly that this was just like earlier today when I had stood before my old house. That strange feeling that here was something that was mine, but yet clearly wasn't mine anymore. There was the usual round of greetings, and I was glad of the flurry of hugs, handshakes, and hellos, for it meant that by the time Matt leaned down to kiss me lightly on the cheek, I had pretty much suppressed my purely hormonal reaction at seeing him again. Katy too leaned over to kiss me hello, and I saw some unreadable flicker behind her eyes as she took in my scarred face. Not that the sky itself should be a shock to any one of them. They had all visited me in hospital many times in the immediate aftermath of the accident, until I had driven them all away. The evening was both a success and a failure. On the surface, we appeared to play our roles well. There was the happy couple to be surrounded by their old friends gathered together from far and wide to wish them well, but it felt like we were all second-rate actors in a rather unoriginal play. We all said that the right things, raised our glasses for toast at the appropriate moments, but somehow the effort of not saying something about the last time we had all sat together around a dining table was so immense that it suffocated any real pleasure. I wondered how it felt to Kate and Dave, and if they were aware of it too. I had assumed incorrectly, as it turned out, that most of the old group had still met up during the university breaks, So it was surprising to learn that although they had seen each other in ones and twos, not once in their intervening years, there been an event where everyone had been together. I hadn't known that the loss of Jimmy and my own disappearance had so effectively dissolved the glue between us. At least there were no awkward gaps in the conversation. There was enough profound to cover in bringing everyone up to date with their lives that silence wasn't the problem. We learned that Matt had been working in his family's business since finishing uni, and Kathy was something in PR. She did explain it. But to be honest, I wasn't listening properly. I was far more fascinated with her body language than the words she spoke. From the moment she had sat down at the table, her every action screeched out her possession of Matt. She was all but entwined around him as we waited to be served. In fact, given that most of her limbs seemed to be twisted in some way around his, I couldn't help wondering if she'd have an arm free to it. And the weird thing was, I knew this show of display was all for me, but why? It had been years since Matt and I had broken apart. In fact, will be a better way to describe it. And after excruciatingly painful and abortive attempts, he had finally stopped trying to get in touch in the hope that I was going to change my mind. I'd made it perfectly clear that I didn't want him in my life, and it was as true today as it had been back then. So what was with Kathy's astonishing behavior? As our last course was cleared away, the wine waiter appeared at my elbow to refill my glass. I quickly covered its surface with my hand. No, no more for me. Thank you. You're not driving, are you? Queried Trevor, who clearly had no intention of sending from any proffered alcoholic beverage. No, I came by taxi, I replied. I'd been wondering when someone was going to notice that I'd had no more than a couple of sips of wine all night. I just think I'm going to need a clear head to cope with Sarah tomorrow. If not, she'll drive me totally crazy. Sarah pretended to look offended, and everyone laughed. They all seemed to accept the lie. In truth, I knew I shouldn't have drunk any alcohol at all after the amount of painkillers I'd taken that day. And then, as if by thinking of it, my headache flared up again in a sudden blazing torch of agony. I got to my feet, hoping nobody had noticed that I needed to rest my hands on the table to steady myself. If you will excuse me in a moment, I said to no one in particular, and using every effort in my power, I walked in what I hope was a straight line toward the ladies. Once safely in the rather opulent cloakroom, I let out a long shaky sigh of relief and lowered myself gently onto a small velvet-covered bench. The pain was still searingly strong behind my eyes, so intense that my vision was beginning to blur at the edges. It had only been this severe a couple of times before, and I'd had much more warning on those occasions. Never before had the pain erupted as it had just now. I didn't doubt that the tension I'd been under all day had probably not helped the situation. My fingers shook as I reached into my handbag for my pills. I almost cried in frustration as the child-proof cup nearly defeated me, cracking my fingernail in my haste to pry open the container. Two pills again, once more without water. I closed my eyes against the brightly lit room and waited until I felt a little more in control. I knew now that the time for putting off those hospital tasks was long past. This wasn't just going to go away by itself. However frightening the results might be, something was seriously wrong, and not knowing what it was going to make it any better. There was, I suppose, some sort of black irony in realizing I still suffered from the effects of my injuries during the only time I'd returned to the place I had sustained them. Just let me get through this wedding weekend, I promised myself, and I'll make the appointment first thing on Monday. By now, I had exceeded the amount of time I could reasonably be absent from the table without having Sarah come looking for me. I didn't want her to think the reason I'd been missing so long had anything to do with Katie's territorial display, and I certainly didn't want her to come in and figure out the reason was because I was suddenly terrified there was something seriously wrong with me. I got to my feet and was pleased to find that I didn't feel nearly as shaky as I had before, and my vision was no longer blurred. I rinsed my hands under cool water and then carefully saturated and squeezed out one of the small folded flannel towels from the basket beside the basins and pressed the weighted clothes against my forehead. I was on the point of returning to the others when the door of the cloak room swung open and Kathy walked in. "Everything okay?" she asked, and though she'd used the right words, the tone was all wrong. Or perhaps it was just that her eyes held zero interest in my response. When had Kathy become so hard? Sure, there had always been an abrasive side to her, but we'd still been friends. What had I done to her to warrant this attitude? If anything, she should be grateful. It was clear she had always been interested in math, so I'd have thought she had been pleased that I'd voluntarily taken myself out of the picture. And besides, that was all years ago. Teenage stuff. Surely we were beyond all that now. I'm fine, just a little tired. It's been a hectic week at work, I lied. Sorry, what did you say? You do again? Nice to know she'd paying attention when I'd been talking about it earlier. I'm a secretary. Oh yes, never did get to go into journalism then. That was what you were going to do, wasn't it? Bit. How could she be so thoughtless? She knew only too well why all my plans for that particular life had been cut short and how I'd never been able to go to university as I'd intended. No, I hope my voice sounded less venomous than it did in my head. Obviously, everything changed after. She nodded and may have looked just the smallest bit shamefaced for the clumsy way she had forced the topic in difficult direction, but just when I thought she might be displaying a modicum of compassion, it was lost as she made a great show of brushing back her blonde mane from her immaculate face and leaning closer to the mirror as though scrutinizing for imperfections. There were none. I could have told her that whatever she saw, be it her own perfect reflections or my own scarred, damaged one, the malice seemed to instantly dissipate. Deciding that there was no competition to be feared, here she turned and gave me an artless smile. I hope you won't take offense, Rachel, but have you ever thought of seeing if something could be done about your face? You used to be such a pretty girl. For a weak moment, I considered playing dumb innocently, asking, "My face? Why? Is there something wrong with it?" But I didn't, and anyway, as much as I was unhappy with the way I looked, I had no intention of visiting any plastic surgeon she was about to recommend it to me, and I'd be crazy if I expected the shallow and unthinking person Kathy seemed to have become to understand that the problem wasn't that nothing could be done, but more that I didn't feel I deserved to have things improved. Certainly, my father and Sarah had both raised this topic years before with a great deal more tact and diplomacy, had been unable to comprehend what they saw as my mature logic. Fortunately, the door of the cloakroom swung open then to herald Sarah's arrival. There was an urgency about her entrance that was almost comical. She swept the pair of us with a knowing look, and I knew she had instantly assessed what was going on. I recognized a look on her face from many an altercation in our past, and shook my head almost imperceptibly. Reluctantly, the fire in her gaze was doused. I suspected she'd been looking forward to saying something to Kathy that definitely should remain unsaid. "Have we moved my party in here? Then, girls," she breathed, joining us at the mirror and linking her arm through mine in an obvious display of solidarity. Katie was insensitive, but not entirely oblivious. "No, no, Rachel and I were just catching up. Let's go." But then Kathy, being Kathy, couldn't resist one last poisoned dart. "I'm sure Matt will be worrying about what's happened to me. If he was worried, he hid it well. However, as I settled back into my seat, I picked up on the threads of the one conversation that had been dreading all night. I felt my heart plummet in my chest like a wrecking ball. Phil was clearly in the middle of saying something to Dave about Jimmy, such tragic and stupid ways. Such a great block, Dave murmured a non-committal response, and I guess that Sarah had already pre-warned him. Tried to divert the conversation from this topic if it surfaced. Nothing was ever the same after that night. Not for any of us, said Phil. The silence around the table that followed was its own acknowledgement. I felt rather than saw almost every eye turn to me. I guess they were right in thinking that I had been affected the most. But the scars on my face were nothing compared to the ones that scarred me deep inside. Come on now, let's not do this tonight, thought Sarah. No, of course, I agreed. And though I kept my eyes averted to the table close, I knew meaningfully glances were being directed my way. It was all getting a little too intense, and I was overcome by a certain irresistible desire. For the safe anonymity of my hotel bedroom, I had to break up the party I began, and heard a small chorus of guilty noise from around the table, and it's not just because of Jimmy. My voice hesitated before being able to form his name, but I really do have a pretty bad headache, so if you don't mind, I think I call it a night for now. Sarah began to protest, but then thought better of it. Sure, sweetie, it's been a busy day for everyone. When I realized that she tended to win the whole evening up, I felt instantly ashamed. No, Sarah, you'll stay. You haven't even had coffee yet. I'll just grab a cab. Please don't break up the party because of me. Please, I got to my feet. Sarah still looked as though she was wavering, but then Dave interceded. Let me go outside with you to hail a cab, he offered. Trevor, why don't you order some coffees and brandies? I gave him a grateful smile. No wonder Sarah loved him. He was worthy of her after all. No need for a cab, a familiar dark voice interjected. I've got my car outside. I'll run the show back. Second back by Matt's unexpected offer. For apart from his initial greeting, this had been the first remark he had actually directed to me all evening. Before I even had a chance to react, he dropped a swift kiss on Kathy's forehead. Won't be long, he assured her, and then turning to look across at me, said, Shall we? I was about to protest to insist that his offer really wasn't necessary and that getting a cab was by far and away the easiest solution, and then I caught a sight of Kathy's face. Rage, disbelief, and total indignation all battled for pole position. It was weak, I knew, but it was what decided me. I owed her this for the cloakroom incident. I reached down, collected my bag, and smiled at my old friend. Sorry to leave so soon, but I'll see you at all. But I'll see you all at the wedding on Saturday. Good night. As I walked away from the table, felt Matt place a guiding hand at the small of my back to steer me past a waiter approaching the table with a tray of coffees. I heard the echoing chorus of goodbyes as we walked away. Strangely enough, Katie's voice wasn't among them. Outside in the bracing December air, I took a step away from him, deliberately breaking the lingering contact of his hand against me. This way, he instructed, raising his arm to blip a key toward a low, dark, sleek-looking vehicle parked under a bright sodium arc light. He opened the passenger door and cupped my elbow briefly as I lowered myself onto cream-colored leather as soft as butter. I waited until he had joined me in the car before commenting, "Well, this is certainly far more luxurious than a taxi. A new toy?" He gave a little shrug. "It's a company car." Oh, I think that's all for tonight. Thank you.